Have you ever been reading something and came across something that made you go, what? Why is that in there? Or why did the author do that? That happens to me all the time. When we're on the road traveling, we listen to audiobooks, and sometimes they got 2 or 3 plots going, and I'm off in La La Land or had a nap or something. And I wake up, I don't know where we are in this book. And Joanne always seems to be able to track everything that's going on in these books. I'm like off, so I'm always asking her, Joanne, what happened? What's going on? And she gives me a little summary, and then I'm caught up, right? Well, it's so disconcerting because it happens to me when I'm reading Scripture. Has that happened to you? You see reading along, and you go, what? Why is that in there? I'm reading through Deuteronomy and Exodus, and I'm going, some of these things are awful. Did God really demand they do these things? Like, you can't figure it out. Well, in our long passage today, John is weaving 2 plots together. And, of course, the commentators are all over the place. Some of them try to rearrange them, thinking he's made a mess out of it, and somebody's just kind of ad hoc thrown stories together. But that's not what he did. He's designed something here, the author of John, that is telling us something. And it's important to know why he did it. These 2 plot lines are apparently familiar to everybody that he's writing to, all the churches. They know these stories. They've appeared in 3 separate Gospels before he wrote his. And people, they tell these stories over and over and over and over because they lived the events of Jesus. And these things were, welded on their hearts. And you know how people tell the same stories over and over of important things that happen in our life? Well, that's what they did with these stories. So John arranges his stories in his gospel, not necessarily chronological. It's according to topic and the purpose. It sort of sounds chronological, but that's not really what he's doing. He's arranging things topically. And that's what he's done with the stories here. He has a purpose for weaving these stories together. And our task, my task this week, was to find out why he did it this way. What was his purpose? Well, we're going to read this passage, and you see if you can figure out what his purpose is, and then maybe we can agree or not when we get into the sermon. John 18, 15 to 27. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest, so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You aren't one of these men's disciples too, are you?" "I am not," he said. Now the slaves and the temple police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. And they were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Did you see that left turn there? What? "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus answered him. "I have always taught in the synagogue and the temple complex where the Jews congregate, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said." And when he'd said these things, one of the temple police standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" "If I have spoken wrongly," Jesus answered him, "give evidence of the wrong. But if I've spoken rightly, why did you hit me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. And they said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, what do you think he's doing? Any idea? These 2 events happened at the same time, right? How do you tell a story where 2 things are happening at the same time? You weave them together. Or you tell one, and then you say, meanwhile, and then tell the other one. But John's making a point by weaving them together. Let's look more closely at this story and find out what this point is. Now, as I've said before, the writers of the Gospels are writing on these scrolls, right? And they, it get that big, but you can't get, a scroll like this. And so they had to be really succinct and careful and only put in things into that scroll that were important. And so everything that's in here is important. There's nothing irrelevant to the point John is trying to make. Everything he puts in there furthers his point that Jesus is the Son of God, Messiah, King of Israel, who came to save us. Everything points to that. Also bear in mind that this author likes to use symbols. The whole book of Revelation is symbols, and so John is full of symbols. And references to the stories that everybody already knew. He didn't have to repeat them again in this thing, in his gospel. These references are, I don't know if you know what a hyperlink is. It's an internet thing. You click on a link and bang, it takes you to someplace. Well, our memories have things like that. You say one word, you say the rooster crowed, and the whole story comes to your head. You know what it's about. You don't need to say the whole story. Well, that's what's going on here. Now look at some of these details. They'll tell us why he wove these stories together. First, the author sets the stage. Now all the other disciples had run off. Peter and the other disciple, however, apparently didn't run far. And they followed Jesus apparently at some distance behind him. And right there we see Peter following Jesus. That's important. Peter was following Jesus. He was a serious disciple. Think about what he's doing. He's courageously walking right into the den of snakes, as it were. He's walking into trouble because he wants to follow Jesus. So he walks right up to the gate of the house of Annas, but can't get in. Now this is real interesting, the way that most translations translate this word. This other disciple was a friend of the high priest, not just an acquaintance, not just known. The Greek word means a close friend. Isn't that interesting? So he was a friend of the family, this other disciple, and John doesn't want us to know who this other disciple was. Maybe it would put the guy in danger. Of course, the commentators are all over the place wanting it to be John himself, this beloved disciple, but I don't think so. I think that John just didn't want anybody to know who this other disciple was. And so he walked up to this girl that was guarding the gate and assured her that Peter was all right. And so she was able to let him in, but not before he answered a question. She had a question for him. It's unlikely that a disciple would appear at the door of Annas, So her questions assume he's going to answer no. And so she asks, "You aren't one of this man's disciples, are you?" And she didn't want to allow a rebel right into the house of Annas, right? That's her job, to keep out the thieves and robbers and rebels and whoever. Keep the peace in there. So she expected a negative answer. And Peter just went along so he could get in. No big deal, right? She's just a servant girl. No, I'm not one of his. You're right. So he walks in. And there he is now, inside the gate, standing in the courtyard of the house of Annas. This is really scary. This is scary stuff. Annas is the mafia don of Jerusalem. And Annas is Jesus over there interrogating him. So Peter feels the cold. John's making a point of that. It was cold. It's night, and it's cold. Another gospel quoted Jesus saying that at his arrest it was the hour of darkness. And you remember Judas, John made a point of saying that Judas went out into the night. So there's this whole sense of night and dark foreboding that he has set up here. But over there's a charcoal fire. And it's surrounded by the very people who arrested Jesus. Peter's got to be the most courageous person in the Gospels, except for maybe Paul. Paul wasn't in the Gospels, so let's stick with Peter. So he goes over there to warm himself. Could he have put himself in any more danger? I don't think so. I wonder, does John want us to see a metaphor here of flirting with the danger of sin? I don't know. Putting ourselves in a place of temptation. When I was caseworker at a halfway house, that's one of the things the guys made sure they didn't do. There's certain streets they wouldn't walk down because the liquor store was there. They wouldn't put themselves in that place of temptation, you know. Maybe that's one of the things that John is trying us to see here. Now, let's look at this charcoal fire. You all know about charcoal fires. When the flames die down, how much light does a charcoal fire cast? Almost nothing. It was a full moon that night, but still it's really dark. You can't hardly see anybody. You can see kind of shadows, and if there's somebody's face, you'd have to get right up to them to see them, who it is. Everybody's obscured. So no one's sure about this stranger who just walked in through the gate and is standing there warming himself. They want to question him, but John just leaves the story there and goes over to the interrogation of Jesus. Here's Peter warming himself, and John just leaves him there. So let's go over to verse 19. Do you see the order of the questions that Annas asks Jesus in the Bible? Generally, these lists of things, the first one's most important, and they get less as they go along. So the first question is the most important one, and the first question is about Jesus' disciples. There was real danger in Jerusalem at Passover time because the whole city was packed solid full of people. And these were kind of rebellious people, right? The whole city could rise up in an uproar. And so Annas wanted to make sure that Jesus didn't have some hidden army somewhere that was going to attack the Romans. And not only the Romans, Annas himself, as a lackey of Rome. You know, Jesus wants to continue protecting his disciples. So do you notice that he doesn't even answer Annas' question about his followers, his disciples? Jesus has absolutely no fear of this false high priest. Jesus addresses him like a teacher would address an unruly student, or a king would reprove an arrogant subject. Jesus stands there and rebukes him, reminds him of the law he should know. It was unlawful to try to get the accused to incriminate themselves, and a person is innocent until proven guilty according to Jewish law. And if you're going to accuse someone, it has to be by 2 witnesses, and it has to be an official trial during the day. Annas was breaking all the rules. And Jesus was angry with him. So Jesus asked, "Why do you question me? You're not supposed to. Question those who heard what I told them." He's asking for witnesses. They know what I said. Jesus didn't say anything in secret. He explained privately to his disciples some of the parables, but everything was laid out there. Well, of course, that was too much for the temple guard, right? I can just see this guy. He's like, you've watched movies, so you know what the muscle is behind the guy, you know? Yeah, so this big guy's back there, and this guy's insulting the boss, so he goes up and whacks him across the face. He's not used to prisoners rebuking Annas. He's used to prisoners cowering in fear. So he has to defend the honor of his employer, of course. Well, does that big old slap across the face bring Jesus into line? Hardly. No. John is showing us who is in control here, and it's not Annas or the guard, it's Jesus is in control here. The prisoner's in control. I love this. And John is always doing his reversals, as we've seen before. Jesus knows the law better than the religious leaders of Jerusalem. So King Jesus retorts as if the guard didn't know the law either. And he says, if I've spoken wrongly about all the witnesses you need and all this, if I've spoken wrongly, tell me. If I spoke right, why'd you hit me? Jesus is demanding a public trial. You see what he's doing? This ad hoc interrogation of Annas is unlawful. Jesus is asking for an actual trial. Annas can see he's not getting anywhere with this guy, so he sends him off to Caiaphas. And John doesn't tell us anything about what happened with Caiaphas. That's in the other Gospels. He doesn't need to talk about it. So John now switches back to poor Peter, standing there in the dark, trying to get warm while also trying to hide his face from all these skeptical eyes trying to see who he is. And they ask him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" They can't imagine a disciple of Jesus would dare to stand there with them who had just arrested Jesus. And they expect him to answer no, which again he falls into. But this next guy thinks he knows who Peter is. And he gets right up in Peter's face where he can see him. And sure enough, this is the guy who cut the ear off of maybe his cousin. So his question demands a yes. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter is at his wit's end by this time. He's terrified by this time. So he denies Jesus a third time. Now, John sticks in a reference to a story they all know very well. He simply says, "A rooster crowed." There is so much pain in those few words that everybody remembers. Luke had written this, so they all knew this. "The Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, 'Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." Jesus had predicted that Peter would do this. So what Peter had done was already known and forgiven long before he did it. The grace of God isn't limited by our circumstances or failures. They're all known and forgiven already. We're forgiven before we do anything. I just think that's amazing. Grace of God. Of course, that doesn't say we should go ahead and do anything, but Jesus knows. Peter was so on fire for the Lord. He claimed he would lay down his life for Jesus, and he tried to. But here in the dark, cold, with all these enemies surrounding him, Peter was just overwhelmed. Weakness became searingly obvious. So that's the story with its symbols and references. Now, can we see what John is doing with this story? He's contrasting Peter and Jesus. There's 2 trials going on. He's showing that Jesus isn't afraid of even the most powerful religious ruler, the most ruthless guy in Jerusalem. But Peter is afraid of a servant girl. A slave girl, in fact. Peter put himself in danger of great temptation, and once stuck there, he couldn't leave. He was a prisoner of his own weakness, and he failed. Jesus, on the other hand, stood wise and fearless as a king before the most dangerous and wily snake of a ruler in Jerusalem. The contrast between Jesus and Peter is stark. Now, Luke adds an important detail that, again, they probably already know. Jesus looked out toward the courtyard and toward Peter. What love was in those dark eyes as they looked at Peter across the courtyard. How Jesus loved that man. He knew the risks Peter took to be there. Peter failed his trial. But we know that later Jesus convinces Peter that they do still love each other. And he should now go ahead and teach and encourage Jesus' other followers. Jesus loved Peter. He knew all about him. But Peter didn't know himself at all. And this is where we're coming to an interesting application. John and the other Gospels show how confident Peter is. He's a family man. He's a successful businessman with hired help. He's used to being in charge. He's used to being the boss. He's the stalwart one, the dependable one. He's the one that would fight to the death. Literally. Peter didn't expect to be afraid. Fear was not in Peter's character. So when it came, he wasn't ready for it. And he fell like the most cowardly person. How incredibly humiliating this must have been for him. Not only had he denied his Lord, he had shamed himself before the whole courtyard of slaves and guards. He is even afraid of a slave girl. This, Peter did not expect. Now here's the remarkable thing about this story. The story isn't about Jesus really. It's about Peter. It's Peter's story. It's important for us as followers of Jesus to understand Peter. And Peter knew this. And he probably told this incredibly humiliating story over and over and over himself. It's been speculated that Mark's gospel was really the memoirs of Peter. We don't know that for sure, but that's traditionally what it is. But Mark is even more harsh than John about this story. He reports that Peter started to curse and to swear an oath, saying, "I don't know this man you're talking about." And immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered that Jesus had spoken the word to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And when he thought about it, he began to weep bitterly right in front of everyone. All the guards, servant girls, slaves, everybody saw Peter weeping. Why is this story so important to us? At our age, I think we realize by now that we really don't know ourselves as well as we thought we did. We don't know what we would do under any given circumstance, not necessarily. We surprise ourselves. We react in ways that are very different from what we would plan to do or even what we would expect in someone else. Or even what we'd hope we would do. Jesus knows us. He knows what we're going to do. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows that we will put ourselves into situations that just gang up on us against our better judgment, and we'll end up thinking and doing something that we never would have thought we would do. We'd never think we would do that, but Jesus did. So on that cold night, Peter learned one of the most important lessons of his life. He learned that he's weak. He learned that he's so weak and prone to sin, far worse than he ever imagined. He thought he was important. He thought he was a mover and a shaker. He thought He was the boss. But he found out he was a slave to his own body and the circumstances that happen in life. And given the wrong situation, he would react and there's nothing he could do about it. Couldn't even keep from crying in front of all those people. Peter. We should take this to heart, I think. We're not as stable and controlled as we like to think we are. Life can easily overwhelm us. Easily overwhelm us. But like Peter, we learn that our value doesn't find its source in us. That's not our value. Sure, we can do some things. Yeah, that's good. But that's not where our value lies. Our value lies in what Jesus can do through us. And his forgiveness frees us from focusing on how bad we are. Because we aren't in his eyes. Because he knows what he's doing through us. Look at what happened to Peter. And then he ended up being the head of the church. Because he knew he was weak. I think it's amazing. We may not even know what Jesus is accomplishing through us. And sometimes I think it's probably a good thing we don't know, or we might get prideful about it. Jesus is a master at using broken tools to create magnificent people. Jesus, I don't know, he's just simply amazing to me. It's amazing what God can do with flawed people. Even his whole church, the history of the Christian church, my goodness, the disastrous and horrific things that are accomplished in Jesus' name. Accomplished, did I say? I think it's the wrong word. But look how he has grown his church in love and billions of people. He works with flawed human beings. We can count on it. Peter, not long after this, 40 days maybe, he preached, and a great revival broke out amongst Jews who had experienced what had happened those days. And thousands came to worship Jesus as God. Jews worshiping Jesus as God. Peter preached the best sermon ever. Just reminded them of what they saw. Praise God that our sin and failure doesn't limit what Jesus is doing through our lives. He lifts us up as on eagle's wings to accomplish reconciliation with his creation and with his many children here in town and even around the world as we give so people can go out and do that. Jesus looks across the courtyard at us. Oh, how he loves you and me. Oh, how he loves you and me. He gave his life, what more could he give? Oh, how he loves me. Oh, how he loves you. Oh, how he loves you and me. Amen.